Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that while we are meeting virtually, the land Dying with Dignity Canada is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Indigenous, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, and with the Mississaugas of the Credit. We invite and encourage you to do your own research regarding the various treaties, and in particular, the land in which you're on while meeting with us today. So I am so thrilled to welcome you to another session of Focused Forum. Throughout this series, we aim to provide you with information and key takeaways, as well as create a space for the conversation on end-of-life topics and MAID, alongside the professionals that know it best. So before I welcome today's presenter, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. Everyone on the call today is muted. However, there will be an opportunity to submit questions. To do so, please type your questions into the question bar on the Zoom side panel, and we will read it out for you at the end. Please try to keep your questions as concise and clear as possible. And while we are going to try and get to as many viewer questions as possible, unfortunately, we may not get to everyone. So if you have any outstanding questions following the webinar or questions that are quite personal in nature, please feel free to contact us at support@dyingwithdignity.ca, and we will follow up with you individually. We're also going to be sending a post-webinar survey that will pop up on your screen after the webinar. It's going to give you the opportunity to share your feedback, and also please note that this session is recorded, so you'll be able to watch it again later, and there's no need for you to take notes. All right, and now to introduce today's speaker. Michaela Kelly lives in Prince George, BC, on the traditional territory of the Lheidli T'enneh. She has a Master's of Science in Epidemiology from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and she's been engaged in MAID research since 2016 and is currently a medical student at the University of British Columbia. All right, so that's our introduction. I know I'm very excited to hear from Michaela, and she's going to be interviewing us for today, Melissa. So I'm going to pass it on to you and let you take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, Amanda, for the introduction. And welcome, Michaela. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. Just to let everyone know, so we're going to do a few questions. We're going to ask Michaela some questions from 2 research studies that she participated or she took part in, and then we're going to have some opportunity for Q&A at the end. But first, to get us started, we'd love to know more about yourself, Michaela, and what led you to pursue research in medical assistance in dying.
Yeah, well, it's great to be here today. So I guess it was fun to think about this question. I appreciate you sending it along. At first, I started research with Dr. Ellen Wiebe because she was mostly doing research about IUDs and abortions. And if she'd said I'm doing research about MAID, I don't know if I would have been in touch with her. But then when I got in touch with her and our first project was about assisted death, I just really fell in love with it then. I think the first project was about patient experience with assisted death. And my job was just to be the transcriber. Which doesn't sound very interesting, but honestly, transcribing those interviews of patients talking about why they wanted assisted death and why they were ready to die and what their life was like, and just deep, deep reflections about life and death and the power of assisted death for them got me hooked, I guess. I haven't experienced something so powerful as listening to those interviews and transcribing them and really getting to know them.
That's great. Yeah, I can certainly understand like the power of, these conversations and how it's great to be able to listen to those people reflecting and being able to understand their choice. So I'm glad that you're, it sparked so much interest for you and now you're in this field. So that's great. So we want to go through the first research study with you. And I know you have some slides. So if you want to get that up now, that'd be great. So this first study was done in 2022 and was also co-authored by Dr. Ellen Wiebe, who you mentioned. And it's called Are Unmet Needs Driving Requests for MAID, a qualitative study of Canadian MAID providers. So you and your research fellows interviewed a group of MAID providers on their combined 3,700 plus MAID assessments and their experiences. So I guess the first question, if you want, or did you want to kind of introduce it right now?
Oh, that's fine. I just want to check, is the screen sharing okay?
It is sharing, but it's on your speaker notes. Okay. So it might be the other screen.
All right. There we go.
Perfect.
Okay.
Okay, great. So the first question is, what was the methodology of the research study and how did you frame your interviews and collect the data for this research?
Yeah, so this one was a qualitative study. So that means we interviewed participants and we used a semi-structured interview guide. So we first reached out to CAMAT members, so the Canadian Association of MAID Assessors and Providers, and we invited their assessors to participate in the study. So then whoever was interested got in touch with us, and we drafted an interview guide based on a working group from CAMAT. So they had a group designed to help figure out what's the best way to assess patients with some complicated needs and that sort of thing. So we had their support to develop the guide. And then from there, we did semi-structured interviews. So we used the guide just as a framework. So we sort of had the major topics lined out, and then our main goal was to hear from participants about what was most important to them about the topic. And I think that's a really important piece to highlight, because as researchers, it's easy to think like, oh, we know the best questions to ask. But I think we know the best place to start, or we know a place to start, and then the participants actually know the most valuable places to go from there. So over time, we edit the interview guide so that we can really focus on what's important to the participants. Does that answer your first question? Oh, you're muted, Melissa.
Yeah, you got me. Yes, that's great. I think that's a great answer to, introduce the study and how it looked. What was the aim of this study when you started it?
Yeah, I think the main aim was, well, the study came out of this idea that there had been concerns raised that people might have an easier time accessing MAID than accessing treatments that would either fix their symptoms or that sort of thing. And so there was sort of worry around that. So we wanted to see if that was happening. And I think it was the easiest place to go for that is the providers, because they have, although they're not the patients themselves, they do have, as you mentioned, they have a diverse, like a broad experience with many patients. And so interviewing just 20 providers gets us lots of information about lots of patient experiences, even though it's not talking to the patient themselves.
Yeah, definitely. So many providers, they see so many patients. So yeah, they definitely have that experience and knowledge, and so many unique cases too, right? That no case is the same. With this study, what were some of the key takeaways? Yeah,
so I guess I realized I didn't quite answer your aims. I'll just briefly say that the aims then were about identifying the provider's experience and perspective, and how they balanced this idea that not everyone has equal access to treatments potentially, and if they had experienced that come up in their own practice and how they were handling that. So yeah, the main takeaway, which I think we were really excited to see, was that unmet needs were really rare. So I've just included a few quotes here. So participants really emphasized over and over again that when we asked them, have you worked with patients where you felt like unmet needs were driving their request for MAID, they really said like, no, I don't see this very often. It's extremely unusual that somebody doesn't have needs that are meetable. One said, It's not people who have gone without or who don't have the resources, who don't have the support. Most of the patients they work with, they said, most of them do. Most of them choose this option because their life has gotten to a point where it's no longer quality for them because their quality was really high for much of their life. So they really emphasize that it's not this idea that someone has had an unmet need that is ongoing, but that people really have access to what they need for the most part and are choosing to have MAID regardless of that. So that was the sort of main headline take-home message. But at the same time, they also said that loneliness and poverty were some of the ones that came up. So this was kind of interesting because we went into the study wondering if long wait times or expensive treatments would be kind of the big things that we heard about. And so it was a bit surprising to hear actually loneliness come up a lot. So one participant, I'll just read a couple of these quotes. One said, more so what I consider sometimes are people who are lonely, who have no children, no partner, no close relatives nearby. That's the driver I worry about mostly, the social situation. And so they emphasize this factor of loneliness. In the next example here, it was an 88-year-old woman who had osteoarthritis, and previously she had had her son to care for, but now she didn't have that anymore. And so the provider said she has no purpose. So the dilemma or the question is, how do you help people find purpose? And maybe that is the role of the provider, maybe it's not the role of the provider, but that was the ethical dilemma. It wasn't necessarily connecting that patient to a treatment that could help their symptoms. And then another just emphasized certainly the human emptiness, and that kind of compounds the physical suffering sometimes. So I would say that was a really kind of surprising takeaway. Another one was about poverty. So again, unmet needs weren't that common, but poverty and social determinants of health did come up a little bit. And I think these quotes summarize it pretty well, so I won't talk too much. I'll just read the quote. One said, once he was in an accessible apartment where he could actually leave the building safely and easily, his quality of life improved to the point where he was able to delay his desire to go ahead with MAID for several months. And he lived for several months longer with a very good quality of life before ultimately choosing to go ahead with MAID when his condition progressed. And I think that's a really powerful example of a way that social determinant of health, a housing issue, increased the suffering for a patient. And then the provider was able to have a role in improving that housing situation. And once that happened, then the patient delayed MAID. But I think it's really interesting here that it didn't remedy everything. It didn't make the patient not want to go on and get MAID in the end, but it did make the quality of life just a bit better to want to live a few more months. And so I think that sort of shows all spectrums of how this came up in interviews. Yeah. And then I guess to sort of finish up with this one, the last key takeaway is that our participants really emphasized the dilemma between, or the idea that MAID isn't meant to solve all these structural inequalities. And one participant said, I think we live in a society where we have these structural inequities. That really sucks. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't be fighting to overcome those things. We can live in a society with those inequities and have MAID. It's not an ideal society to have. I don't like that society, but it doesn't mean that we should be sheltering people from the option of having an assisted death. I think we keep seeing death and MAID in particular as the wrong outcome. And that's not my choice or my decision to make for somebody. And so this, I think, emphasizes the fact that we went in and we wondered, how are people dealing with this ethical dilemma or this conflict that they might experience? And what people said was that it is hard sometimes as a MAID provider, knowing that structural inequities may have contributed to a person's suffering, but that as the provider, that their job isn't to shelter that person from having access to MAID, but is to ensure that they have access to everything that they need to have access to currently, and to provide MAID as an option if that's something they're eligible for and would like. So I also found that pretty powerful.
Yeah, that's definitely, you know, these are very powerful statements, and it's, you know, a big choice that people are, you know, considering, right? And so being able to really reflect and see what, you know, as a MAID provider, what can they do for their patients as well is really important. So yeah, no, these are great takeaways, and it's good that there are some that, you know, were maybe unexpected that you thought of, that, you know, as researchers and being able to understand these other takeaways and how does that work and how can we do more with that. So it's very interesting. Is there anything else that you would like to share from the study? Any other, you know, takeaways or anything that you found personally about this study you wanted to share?
Yeah, I think first it was nice to hear over and over again that unmet needs weren't driving requests for MAID from the provider perspective. And then also to be able to lean into these topics of loneliness and social determinants of health and kind of flesh that out a little bit more. And I think that, not to take away from those findings, because I think they're really important findings, but that we still need to go hear from patients to ask them if they have unmet needs, and that there might be a difference between the way patients describe their needs and whether they've been met or not, and the way the providers interpret their needs. And so I think that those findings should be held in that light and with that limitation for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a really important point, is, you know, the patient's perspective versus the provider's perspective, and what the patient, you know, is considered or considers a quality of life, or what they need compared to what a provider or a doctor. I think it goes for any, you know, patient-doctor relationship, is being able to still allow it to be, you know, a patient-centered care, right? Yeah. So yeah, it's really important. Yeah. Great. So the other research study that you are going to share with us is focused on forced transfers. And so for those who aren't as familiar with what forced transfer is, so a forced transfer occurs when a patient who is requesting MAID is eligible for MAID and could be in an institution where they don't allow MAID provisions on site. They need to be transferred to another, institution or center that they can, you know, have the provision. Unfortunately, this can be a pretty isolating and grueling time, especially if the individual is already, you know, nearing end of life. They've been found eligible and they're already in a very vulnerable state, not only for themselves, but maybe for their loved ones. So it can be a very challenging experience for the patient and their loved ones at end of life. So it is something that, as an organization, Dying with Dignity is definitely focused on advocating to reduce forced transfers. But yeah, it is unfortunately a barrier that so many are facing in Canada. So this research study was done in February 2021 and was entitled Forced and Chosen Transfers for Medical Assistance in Dying Before and During the COVID Pandemic, a Mixed Methods Study. So yeah, with this study, again, what was the methodology used for this research study, and how did you frame your interviews and collect the data?
Mm-hmm. So this study was a mixed methods. So that means that we did the qualitative components, like I talked about before, where we interviewed participants. And then we also did what's called a retrospective chart review, which sounds a bit fancy, but it basically means looking at the medical charts from the MAID Care Coordination Center over a 3-year period. So we looked at charts from 2016 to 2019. And basically the MAID Care coordinators in Vancouver, so this was, I should specify, this was just in one health authority, which in BC, one health authority was Vancouver Coastal Health. So it covered kind of the Vancouver area, the surrounding areas, and a few remote areas in BC, kind of like the old LHINs of Ontario, I think. So just focusing on one health authority. And what we did is we went through the charts and we identified all the patients who had assisted death during that time, where they had assisted death, and if they were moved on the day of their death, we called that a transfer. And so it's also important to note we might have missed some transfers because people might have moved the day before or a week before, but just to be able to define it clearly, we said anyone who moved the day of their assisted death was a transfer. And then we gathered information from the charts about the reason for transfer and any complications or challenges that happened there. And we were really, really lucky to be able to work closely with the MAID care coordinators so that anytime we had questions about what was in the charts, we could connect with them and get more details, which really gave us a clearer picture about any challenges that happened, because those aren't always documented in the charts. So that was the chart review component. And then we use the data from both of those components, the chart review and the qualitative component, to sort of blend them together and get a better picture of what's really happening for transfers in this area. And I should say, I didn't talk about this in the last study, but once we have the interviews conducted, then all the team members read the interviews and we identify what we call themes in the interviews. And so we kind of say we zoom out and think about like, what was the big picture? What was most important to the participants? And then we zoom in and do the themes and kind of detailed coding, and we pull out quotes and all that kind of stuff. And then we zoom out again to say, did we really capture everything? Is this still consistent? And do we all agree that this was most important to the participants? So that is sort of the research methodology in a nutshell. And our aim for this study was to, I think I've written them out here maybe, was to understand the places patients are choosing to die and the reasons they choose those places, and then to also really examine the reasons and the impacts for forced and chosen transfers. And as you said, the study started in February, so we thought it was just going to be about transfers in general, but then with the pandemic in March of that year, beginning, then COVID really impacted transfers even more, so then we wove that into the study as well.
Great. I guess another question, now that you talked about the aim of the study. So what were some of the key takeaways from this study as you were conducting it?
Yeah. So I'll just split it up into the two components just for simplicity's sake. So for the chart review part, there were 444 patients in that health authority in that 3-year period who got MAID. And then it's kind of interesting to see about half of them died in their homes, a quarter died in the hospital, and just over 10% died in hospice. So that's just sort of interesting about where people are choosing or where people are having MAID. And then with that data, it's unclear about whether they've chosen those places or not. And then of that 444, 75 of them transferred on the day of their MAID death to a different location. So the orangey color here is the forced transfers. So 42 people had a forced transfer, and then on this side is the chosen transfers. So slightly fewer people had chosen transfers. And all of the forced transfers in this health authority were due to religious affiliations of the facilities. And so I think that is interesting. And then in terms of the chosen transfers, also interesting is that 2/3 of them, so 21 out of 33 of them, left their homes to die somewhere else. And so I think it's easy to think about transfers maybe as just this issue in hospitals and religious affiliations and needing to move, and that's an issue in itself. But then there's also this other component where people want to have an assisted death and they're living in their homes, but they actually don't want to die in their homes. So then there's sort of a question or an issue of where can they go to have their death.
Did you, sorry, just a quick follow-up question to that, people moving from out of their home to another place to have MAID, did you find the other way around too, people who maybe were in like long-term care facilities or in hospital, and it wasn't necessarily a force, but it was a choice for them to maybe move into a home to have MAID? Did you find that as well in this study?
Definitely, yeah. So I think that about 2/3 of people in their homes wanted to leave, and then let me think, I could do this math. Yeah, then I guess that only leaves 12 other participants in this category who weren't in their homes. Or maybe they were in their homes. No, they weren't in their homes and they chose to move somewhere else. So yes, but it was more common in the chosen transfer category to be living at home and wanting to live somewhere else. But there were, 12 people who were living somewhere else and wanted to maybe move home or move out of care, definitely. Yeah.
Another follow-up question to that, and I'm not sure if you have this information, but were you able to collect where those individuals moved to, or if they didn't want to be in their home, where did they go instead? Was that captured as well?
Yeah, it was captured, and I didn't grab the details before this, but I could definitely follow up with you on that. But we did track exactly, or maybe when we're doing questions at the end, I can pull up the table. We did track where they were and then where they moved to so that we could collect that data for sure.
Okay, perfect. And someone is just asking in the chat that are these stats or these statistics available somewhere online that someone could access?
Yes, definitely. So this study is available online. And so I could share that from this health authority and from this data set. And there's also information that the federal reporting gives about where people are, but they don't have the information about transfers.
Okay.
Yeah.
Perfect. Great. Thank you. All right. Sorry. Keep continuing.
Okay.
I know I was doing some follow-up questions for you.
No, that's all good. Okay. So then what was really beneficial about the interview component of this study is that we got more information about the reasons people transferred, and especially around the impact of the forced transfers. The overwhelming theme that we heard in the interviews with the key informants was that forced transfers increase suffering, which I think wasn't surprising necessarily, but we did get details about the ways it increased suffering. So I've listed a few here. Sometimes the increased suffering was just because the transfer itself could be painful. Moving from a stretcher into a van, out of the van, just the logistics of moving can cause physical pain to someone who is unwell and at the end of their life. Sometimes the suffering was increased because people weren't able to have MAID because they weren't able to transfer. And so again, I think it's easy to think about just the forced transfers and the suffering that causes, but then there's also a whole group of people who weren't captured in our data set of the chart review who didn't go on to have MAID because they were in a facility where they couldn't have it, and that caused suffering as well. There were also, in general, complicated logistics that added barriers and things on the family's to-do lists and just dynamics that created suffering at the end of life. We also heard stories about transfers going through, but then there not being a very acceptable place for the transfer to happen. So someone transferring to a hospice and then the MAID occurring in a storage closet. That kind of thing was really terrible to hear about. And then this also caused suffering for the staff, not just for the patients and family, but because staff can obviously tell their patients are suffering and wish things could be different for them. That was really hard. So in terms of a patient suffering, I've included one quote here. A family member, or this was a provider, a MAID provider, shared a story about someone, and they said he was in acute agony and the medications weren't holding him. The transferring to the stretcher and into the van and out of the van and into the bed was excruciating. His daughter said that he was screaming in agony. And so even the providers are left with this impression of their patient's care. But on the flip side, as always, people are resilient and creative. And so although we heard it caused a lot of suffering, we also heard beautiful stories of ways that patients, staff, and family members were mitigating the suffering. So as a patient example, one provider said, I think a lot of that though was that the patients themselves were incredible and weren't too distressed, fortunately. They didn't necessarily want to have to do it this way, but they were kind of just accepting of it. And I think that really helped their family. So I liked this example because it wasn't just about the patient, reducing suffering for the patient, but a way that the patient limited suffering for their family by kind of getting on board with it and being okay with it. The staff also contributed to this, especially the MAID care coordinators or MAID navigators. So one said, it's the MAID navigator or the MAID nurse. I think that that's also a big mitigating factor. They have a continuous contact person who's a nurse throughout the journey. Also, the staff at the palliative unit help to support them. So I liked this quote because it highlighted the way that even if you have to transfer facilities, that there in some situations can be a feeling that someone is overseeing your care and on this continuously on this journey with you, and that was really beneficial. And then finally, family also helped with this. So someone had to move, and then the provider said her kids were great. They brought all her art with her and put it all over the place. So she died surrounded by her art and her family. It was very special. Despite the fact that she had to be transferred, there was many, many things that mitigated the suffering in that case. It was a good death. So I think it's just also important to highlight that transferring hasn't always led or isn't always this terrible death in the end. It does increase suffering for most people that we heard about, but that there are people are still able to have good deaths in some cases.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's positive to hear.
Yeah.
Oh, I just wanted to comment, it can be such a challenging time for people who are navigating a forced transfer, but it is good to hear that despite having that there are still, they were still able to have a good death with their loved ones.
Yeah. And it wasn't all the stories that we heard, but I do like to, highlight those. For sure.
Yeah, of course.
And then finally, just by nature of the timing of this study, so thinking back to March of 2021, we heard a lot about the ways that COVID impacted transfers. So in some jurisdictions, previously people were able to move from home to a hospital or somewhere to have MAID. I know that's not standard across the board, but in some places that was possible. But then during COVID, that wasn't allowed anymore. So someone said, we were no longer allowed to offer patients to go from home to a facility just for the provision. And so for those, if we think back to the chart review, if 2/3 of the people who chose to transfer were going from home elsewhere, that this is potentially impacting a good number of people who can't do that anymore. And then we heard quite hard stories about people who are in care homes, say, and weren't allowed to have MAID there. So this is a forced transfer on top of COVID. So, so one gentleman, maybe I'll just read the quote and then we can talk about it. So a provider said he was in a care home. This was a forced transfer. He wasn't allowed to be there for MAID. So he was going to transfer anyway, but he decided that he would go early, like 3 or 4 weeks early, because he couldn't have family visit him. And what was the point in staying alive those extra 3 weeks if he couldn't have his family? It was the kind of situation where he shouldn't be at home. He needed full 24-hour care, feeding and diapering and all those things that were really, really hard for his family to do. But there was no way that they were going to leave him all by himself before he died. So I think this really shows the way that the forced transfer was compounded and made a really hard situation by COVID, because if he had to just transfer on the day of his death, he would have still been able to receive the care that he needed in the care home he was in. But because of COVID, he wasn't allowed any visitors. And so that was increasing his loneliness suffering that we talked about in the other study. And so because of that, he makes a decision to go home. And then that is not a terrible situation because it's what he wants, but it's also not the ideal situation because he's not getting the type of care that he should be getting. So we heard a lot of those stories about the pandemic as well. Yeah. And then I'll just speak briefly. So in the retrospective chart review, we looked at both forced and chosen transfers. And then in the interview component, we asked people about both forced and chosen. But what was really important to the key informants or the participants were the forced transfers. That's what they spoke with the most passion about. That's what they wanted to talk about. And so we didn't get that much information about these chosen transfers, although I think it's still a really important and interesting topic. But what we did hear was that the number one reason that people want to leave home to die elsewhere, if they're choosing to do that, is thinking about their family members. So someone said the number one And I have canvassed colleagues about this too. The number one reason people give to transfer out of their home is they don't want family members to have the memory of the MAID procedure and the death in the home. Someone else, I didn't include the quote, but another participant said that people die the way they've lived, and that since people are often caring for their family members, that this decision to move out of the home for an assisted death is just one more way that they're caring for their loved ones. I thought that was also kind of a nice frame.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. Yeah, it's certainly, I certainly hear from folks as well. You know, I do a lot of calls and people do ask, you know, where can I have a MAID procedure? I don't want to have it at home because they don't want to have, that memory there, or, you know, they don't want to have that left with their loved ones. So, yeah, great. We have quite a few, about 3 or 4 follow-up questions to the forced transfers study. But before we go into those, is there anything else that you want to mention about this study?
No, I guess just maybe the same one, that the key informants were largely MAID coordinators and providers, and we heard from one family member, and that this is another place too that it would be nice to hear from more loved ones or from more patients before their death. But that's
Perfect. Okay, so a couple follow-up questions to this study. So for those who moved somewhere for MAID, was it because of lack of providers in the community? Was that ever a theme that was brought up or something mentioned?
Yeah, I think that's an important thing to raise, because I'm sure that has happened. In our situation, we didn't see that in the chart review. Let me think. So the question is, did someone move? Yeah, because there wasn't a provider. So in the Vancouver Health Authority, I think that providers do sometimes travel to different communities to provide MAID. So I don't think that didn't come up in this window of time, but I shouldn't be so bold to say it has never happened.
Yeah, of course. Okay, so another question was, are you planning to expand the forced transfer study to look at all health authorities in BC?
Yeah, I think that would be really useful. One thing that's hard about MAID research across the board is that each province does it a little bit differently, and then each little area does it a little bit differently also. And so it's kind of hard to do huge studies about this type of thing because every little area has different rules and regulations. And so it's hard to get a big picture about what's happening when sometimes it's not happening because of rules and that sort of thing. But I think it would be really, really valuable to expand this, especially because of the time that we caught this was during COVID. And I think that it would be beneficial to see what else is happening.
Would this study, or is there any consideration of doing this study again, kind of now that the pandemic has slowed down a bit? Do you think that you would be able to do the study again, or do you believe that there could be different results where COVID isn't a main factor?
I think that maybe more than COVID is just that people have more experience with MAID and with transfers now. My guess is that if we did it in Vancouver Coastal Health again, we'd have similar results. But maybe if we did it in all of BC or in other areas, we would see different percentages and ratios for sure. But I guess I think the challenges that exist with transfers, and if the main theme is that forced transfer causes suffering, I don't think that finding is going to change if we do the study again. But I think perhaps the number of people who are getting transferred and where they're getting transferred to and where people are choosing to die, I could imagine that changing over time.
Yeah, great. And then just one more question related to this study. Was there any follow-up with loved ones and how their grief process was impacted by the difficulty of transfers?
So as researchers, just doing the retrospective chart review, we personally didn't. But I think in Vancouver Coastal Health, the MAID care coordinators who are in touch with the family members, I think they have their own system to follow up with the people involved in MAID deaths. But I think that does raise an interesting research question about bereavement and grief. And I think that there are people, not our research team, but there are people who are exploring bereavement and grief in MAID, definitely. And I think that's an important topic, yeah.
I mean, I can't name any off the top of my head, but there have certainly been ones about, MAID and bereavement. So certainly interesting. Great. So that's wrapped up for the 2 research studies that we wanted to talk about. So just another, or kind of one of a final question would be, are there any current or ongoing research projects on MAID or end of life that you're currently working on? Or what are some of the current studies that you would like to highlight?
Sure. So I'm just going to share my screen again. So I feel really lucky to work with Dr. Ellen Weeb and the rest of our research team, because every single study that we do leads to more and more questions, which I think is a good sign that we don't know the answers, we just get more questions. So yeah, currently with Bill C-7, changes that have come with Bill C-7 and anticipated changes coming this spring, potentially with mental illness as a sole underlying condition, we do have some studies on the go. So from a MAID assessor perspective, right now we're interviewing MAID assessors about their experience working with waivers and working with track 2 patients, or patients whose natural death is not reasonably foreseeable. And then we're also looking at the way that clinicians interpret some of the words in the law. So that's been a really interesting thing to study over the years, how their interpretation changes. So particularly right now, we're looking at the words incurable and irremediable. And I think those are really interesting and important topics right now with track 2 patients. And what does it mean to have a chronic illness? Like, what does irremediable mean in that context? And also, what will it mean in the context of mental illness? And then also the sustainability of MAID programs. So we've heard anecdotally that sort of as the scope of MAID, who is eligible gets closer to the Kate Carter decision, that MAID care court or MAID assessors are getting busier and having the track 2 patients take more time because there's more people to connect with and resources to connect with, and the assessments are just a lot bigger undertakings. And so there's sort of a question about how many people are doing MAID assessments and who's going to continue to do them and what's their workload like and that sort of thing. And then from a patient perspective, we're also interviewing patients right now who qualify under track 2, so who meet all the eligibility criteria, but whose natural death is not reasonably foreseeable. And we're hearing from them about their experience with their MAID assessment process and with their illness or their disease. And then also speaking with patients whose sole underlying condition is mental illness and who currently don't qualify under the law, and kind of why they would want MAID and what they're looking for, to get their perspectives on that before the law changes. So I think that both of these categories are important, and that the MAID assessor perspective is helpful to, I guess, it obviously benefits the MAID assessors and the clinicians, but it also means that if they're comfortable with their work and feeling sustained and supported, then the patient side also gets a boost. So I think ultimately both of these streams work towards better patient care, hopefully.
Yeah. No, yeah, I definitely agree. I think the more, MAID assessors are informed and better understand how to navigate and support themselves, that they're better able to support their patients, and the patients feel more confident too in the process as well. So that's really important to have that dynamic. Another question, which may tie into some of the topics that you're mentioning right now, is what, if any, are some of the current gaps in end of life and MAID research, and are there any research projects you would be interested in seeing fulfilled?
Mhm. Yeah, so I think I'm really excited to see these fulfilled for sure. I think that especially the patient perspective side. So we have interviewed 15 patients for the track 2 study so far, but we'd like to interview more. And I guess, so that component, really hearing about their experience, I think it ties back to the unmet needs study, because I think that it's going to be really important to hear whether or not they feel that their needs have been met, and what that's been like along their course of their illness, because for lots of those patients, it's a really long-term illness that, well, actually, here, I'll just share a quick quote. So when we heard from those patients, they all spoke about long-lasting suffering that couldn't be remedied by anything that they had tried. And so maybe I'll just share, this first quote here says, "I've been down almost every single pathway. There is a level of pain that a person should never have to go into, and I've gone into that route. Over 20 years, I've got about 10 disorders, of which each one of them is enough to bring someone to their knees." And so I think that it's even hard to define what unmet needs means. That obviously, if someone's having lifelong suffering, that there are needs that haven't been met, maybe they're unmeetable, or sort of unpacking that a little bit more from the patient perspective, about what it would mean to have those needs met. And also, I guess, the role of the MAID eligibility. Sorry, I'm just pulling this. Also just the role of MAID eligibility in the process of that. So I think it's easy to think that everybody who has this long chronic suffering without a reasonably foreseeable natural death, that they'll just go on to get MAID if they're allowed to have MAID, quote unquote. But that for lots of people, if they go through the eligibility process and are deemed eligible, that takes a really big weight off, is what we've heard. And so people said the whole MAID process gives me hope. Someone said it takes the word indefinitely off of my pain. And so I think that there's still a lot left to be explored about patients' perspectives of that. And I guess to go back to, we're looking at the terms incurable and irremediable from a provider perspective, but I think what does that mean from a patient perspective is really important. And then obviously with the mental illness changes potentially coming in the spring, I think that is a really big area to explore more, and excited to see how that unfolds.
Yeah, certainly. It's interesting that the comments, about having that weight lifted off, because certainly we hear that from folks who, have gone through that long enduring process of track 2, and having that weight kind of lifted off, and we've heard, it kind of makes them feel a bit better instantly, just knowing that option is there, and that they can access it when they would like. Just a quick follow-up, track 2, would you be able to just quickly define what track 2 is?
Yes, sorry, I've been using that term. So basically, under the old law, C14, there was just one track. And to be eligible under that law, you had to have what is called a reasonably foreseeable natural death. And so then in February of 2021, they took out that requirement, and now we call it C7. But now there are sort of 2 tracks, is what assessors and clinicians often say. And so there's the track for the people who would qualify before, who do have a reasonably foreseeable natural death. And then there's sort of another track for the people who don't have a reasonably foreseeable natural death. And what happens in that case is just that there are a few more safeguards in place that the assessors need to go through, so that before the patient can be eligible for assisted death. One of those things is that there's a 90-day period from the first assessment to the time of provision, so that there's 90 days there where that's not the case for the track 1s. And then there's other things like ensuring that, I thought I had them written out, but just ensuring that the patient has been made available, or has been made aware of all available treatments to relieve the suffering. Yeah.
Mhm.
So yeah, when I say track 2, that's what I'm referring to, is people who, it's not the patient who has terminally ill cancer or is going to die in hospital in the next few days. It's a patient who has kind of a long-standing condition that leads to a lot of suffering, but that they wouldn't die from that condition.
Mhm. Great, thank you. And just another, to clarify too, the waivers. What do you mean by, is that referring to the waiver of final consent?
Yes, great question.
Okay.
Yeah, yes, the waiver of final consent, exactly. So for the track 1 patients only, patients can sign an agreement with a provider so that they don't have to provide consent at the time of their provision, but they sort of, it's called the waiver of final consent. So they give consent at the time that they're signing the waiver, but then that allows for the fact that if they've lost capacity at the time of their provision, if they have one of these waivers of final consent in place, then they would still be able to receive their assisted death on that day.
Great, thank you. Perfect. Well, thanks so much for especially these 2 research studies or perspectives that you're going to be looking at, I think are so valuable and important, especially with track 2 patients, because it is so new in Canada. It's only been available since March of 2021. So it's something that certainly is new and is a perfect time to be able to see how those first few years have been for the patients and the providers. And then of course, come March with MAID and mental illness. That's also such an important area too to be looking at. So I wish you all the best with those research studies, and I hope that they go really well. So this concludes just the Q&A that we had with you. We have just one audience question that I wanted to share with you. So the person asked, given the revised MAID law, what have you found to be the most significant changes in its content or application?
Mm-hmm. The most significant changes. Well, I guess, let me think for a second, in its content or application. I think the biggest change is the fact that people who don't have a reasonably foreseeable natural death can now, some of them are now eligible for MAID and can now start talking with assessors about that. I think that, I think over time, maybe not even necessarily because of the change in the law, but just over time, I think the way that clinicians interpret words shifts. So what does reasonably foreseeable natural death mean has shifted for some clinicians, and not for all clinicians, but for some it has. So some are there's a range of what people are comfortable with, what that means. So for some people, it means, I don't know, 6 months or a year or 5 years, or looking at different cases, legal cases can help define those. So I think that has changed, maybe not even because of Bill C-7 coming in, but just because of people getting more experience and more practice. I think the biggest change is maybe what I spoke about in the unmet needs study, that is sort of the newest dilemma, for lack of a better word, is this idea that there are people that the idea that social determinants of health do increase people's suffering or compound people's suffering, and that even if that's not the reason someone is requesting MAID, that it might be a role in a reason that someone is requesting MAID, and that as a MAID clinician or as society in general, that can be hard to swallow sometimes, but that doesn't mean that we need to say, oh, they can't have MAID. That just means that that's a hard pill to swallow, and that we need more resources in general around supporting people with their social determinants of health. So I think that with Bill C-7, that's been a big shift for some clinicians who are working with patients who are track 2 patients. But again, I'm a researcher only, so I can only speak to what I've heard in interviews.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I feel like both those topics could be a whole, research on its own, or a whole weekend discussion about, reasonably foreseeable, not reasonably foreseeable, and and whatnot. So yeah, those are very important topics that yeah, do deserve to be, you know, looked at and defined. And I think overall, just to be able to help clinicians better understand MAID legislation, and also again in turn to help the patients and better support them. So thank you so much for the work that you're doing as a researcher. It's an important role in the MAID space. So yeah, so I think that is all. So we're ending a little bit short today, but that's okay. So yeah, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. And I know our chat has been quite busy, and Amanda and Kelsey have been handling that. And of course, a lot of great questions from the forced transfer study. So I'm sure a lot of the folks listening in today learned quite a lot. Even a quick, some people already saying, thank you, Michaela, great research, great presentation, keep up the great work. And then someone else said, thank you for the helpful session. This research is very important. So everyone here today is very thankful for your research and your involvement. So thank you again. And for everyone else listening, please go to our website to check out our next webinar. We do have one coming up next week, so you can register online, and we look forward to seeing you there. And if not, this session this session as well will be recorded and can be viewed later on. So yeah, thank you again, and have a great afternoon, everyone.
Thanks so much.
Bye.